All right. Once again, thank everybody for coming to the Wildlife for Lunch webinar today on deer antlers as a management tool, the role of culling, be presented by Dr. Dave Hewitt. Dr. Hewitt's the Stewart Sedman Chair for White-tailed Deer Research at the Cesar Claybrook Wildlife Research Institute. Today's webinar is made possible through funding by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and Texas AgriLife Extension. Dr. Hewitt, with that, I will pass it over to you, and you have control.
All right. Thank you, Clint, and welcome, everybody. I appreciate you taking some time at lunch here to hear about an important deer management activity that we get a lot of questions about, and that we're starting to learn some more about its potential efficacy. So might start with just an observation I've had from talking to different people, and it's not uncommon for me to hear a manager say something to the effect of, "Yeah, God, that culling is really good. You know, we've been doing it for 5 years, and I'm seeing a lot of improvement, really big improvement." And so there's this feeling that the culling's making a big change in their herd. And I'll show you some information today that suggests that that's true, but maybe not in the ways that person is thinking. So from a management situation, you need to decide whether culling is going to be something that you want to incorporate into your program, and if so, what it is that you want to cull. And that's a management decision. It's going to depend on your goals for your individual property and your deer herd, and on characteristics of that herd, how productive it is, and some other things. For you to make that decision, you need some information, and part of that information is going to deal with deer biology and deer biology in general. And then there's going to be other information that's going to be real specific to your ranch and your herd and your goals. And so what I'm going to focus on here will largely be some of the different aspects of deer biology and antler growth patterns that will help you be able to make some of these decisions. There's two broad or general reasons why people may want to or may consider culling bucks, and I'm going to consider culling shooting deer, removing deer with small antlers. One reason might be to simply leave the larger bucks, and a reason to do this might be, if you've got a high density of deer in your place, you need to remove some deer anyway, then why not remove the smaller ones and put yourself in a position to invest your management efforts in the best bucks. And in doing so, the average antler size, would increase because you're moving only the bigger ones. And this is going to be an effect I'm going to refer to as improving the standing crop. So the deer on the property at that time, you can improve the antler size. You can increase the average by removing the smaller ones. Another reason people might consider culling is to make a change in the genetic characteristics of their population, with the idea that they want to try to improve antlers in future generations by removing all the small ones now, and then only the larger ones are going to be breeding. That should change the genetic composition in the future and thereby result in larger antlers in future generations. And I'll go through both of these because there's some information available now to address both of these reasons why people may want to be culling. So really, it's a pretty simple set of questions. If you're interested in culling young deer just to affect the standing crop or that cohort of deer, the key question is if a buck has small antlers at one age, will it also have small antlers as it ages? It will have smaller antlers than other deer of its same age as that cohort gets older. So that's a question that we can address. Also, then we'll move on to a question of whether it's possible to alter antler size of deer in a free-ranging situation through genetics, changing the gene composition of future generations through culling. And then there's some other factors that might come into your decision to cull, and I'll kind of finish up with those. So this first question, if we've got a small antlered buck like this spike buck here maybe, is it likely to turn into a buck like this, or could it potentially turn into a bigger deer like that? If if this is predictable, then culling makes sense. If this little spike buck could turn into is more likely to just turn into this large deer, or excuse me, the smaller deer here, then culling might be a rational a rational decision. So to give you some information on how that may play out and help you make a decision on culling, I'm going to share with you some results from a 10-year project that we conducted here through the Cesar Kleberg Institute, refer to it as the South Texas Buck Capture Project. And what we did is we worked on 5 different ranches, captured bucks at random using a helicopter and net gun, and did that in October, November for the most part, before the hunting season. So we got an idea of what bucks were on the property that particular year and the distribution of antler sizes. We worked on properties near Kingsville, 1 property here in Kleberg County, and then 4 properties in Webb County. One of the areas we captured on for 7 years, another for 9 years, and the other 3 properties we had 10 years of data on. These properties varied in size. We captured on areas from about 12,000 acres up to 25,000 acres, but some of the properties were 100,000 acres or larger. We just captured on a portion of them. A mix of high fence and low fence areas. Some had supplemental feed, some didn't, and it had a mix of buck harvest objectives. Some only shooting mature deer, and we did have a couple of areas that were shooting some cull deer as well. When we caught a deer, we measured its antlers for its buck's Grossboon and Crockett score. We marked those deer so we could identify them later if we caught them. Those deer were harvested at a later time using ear tags, and then also some little pit tags like you might have placed in one of your hunting dogs, and it marks that deer with a unique ID number that we could detect later if we got our hands on that deer. All the deer were aged by the tooth wear replacement method. We had 1 person do this because that can be a subjective method, and Mickey Hellickson, one of the principal investigators on this project, did all that aging. So over 4,000 deer, he stuck his hands in the mouth of every one of those deer. And then we obtained antler measures, not only when we captured them, but also if deer were harvested on these properties, we got measures of their antlers at that time. And after we were done working with them, we kicked them out, and they ran around and did their thing, and then we can use that information to learn about how antler sizes change as a deer ages. So one key part of a decision on this changing antler size as a deer ages is determining at what age antler size peaks out. And here on the graph that we've got up right now, you can see the antler size changing from 1 year old. Yeah, this will show up, down there. Antler changes pretty dramatically to 2 and increases predictably to 3 and 4. And then once you hit antler size, your age around 5, antler size plateaus on average. That doesn't mean individual bucks don't get bigger antlers at 6 and maybe smaller at 7 and things like that, but on average antler size is reaching a plateau. Because estimating ages with tooth wear isn't always that accurate. There's a lot of variation in how deer's teeth wear. We might also look at the antler size changes with age in bucks that we know how old they are, and that's what the red line is. And those were deer that were first captured as fawns or yearlings, so we know how old they were, and then we captured them at later ages. And so those are known age deer. And as you can see, we get the same pattern of antler size reaching a plateau at 5 years of age. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be considering 5 years of age and older as mature deer, recognizing that they're kind of up on that plateau. So we've got a little spike buck. Is he more likely to turn into the 10-pointer as a mature buck that's on the top picture, or is he more likely to be the 7-pointer that's in the lower picture? That's our key question. And there's a couple ways we can look at this. The first way we're going to look at it is by dividing the deer into 2 categories: spike bucks, which have 2 or 3 antler points, and fork bucks, which have 4 or more antler points. If we look at 2 years of age, let me find out where I am here, we can see that if we got the fork antlered bucks on the top, those deer that were fork antlered as yearlings, and the deer that were spike antlered as yearlings are on the dashed line, and they are below here. At 2 years of age, there's about a 15-inch difference between those deer that's kind of dictated by their yearling antler characteristics. And that difference carries on up until 5 years of age. And at 5 years of age, we've got about a 10-inch difference up there with deer that were fork antlered as spikes, as yearlings, I'm sorry, having about 10-inch larger antlers, about 136 Boone and Crockett points, compared to those bucks that were spike antlered as yearlings. They're down around 126. So some evidence that if a deer begins life as a small antlered buck, it's going to remain smaller antlered than its other bucks in its cohort as it ages. Another way that we might look at this is, instead of just looking at spike and fork, just putting our yearling bucks into two classes, we could place them on a continual axis here. So we've got the yearling antler score along the x-axis there, and on the y-axis we've got that same buck's antler score at maturity at 5 years old or older. And you can see there's a positive trend. As yearling antler score gets bigger, those deer have larger antlers when they reach maturity. There's also a fair amount of variation around that. And I think it's some benefit in being aware of that variation. And one thing we can do here on the slide, I've taken those points that were from the bucks that were spikes as yearlings and made them circles. And so here we can see, most of those circles are on the left-hand side of the graph, meaning the bucks that were spike antlered as yearlings had smaller yearling antlers, which makes sense. And the other thing that you can see in this graph now is that there's a lot of variation around that 10-inch difference. So over here, kind of near the y-axis there, where I've just put the red circle, you can see that's our 10-inch difference, with the circle symbol being the 126 antler size of bucks that were spike antlered as yearlings, and the triangle being the 136 antler size at maturity for those bucks that were fork antlered as yearlings. So that's that 10-inch difference. But if you look at that over amongst all the variation in fork and spike antlered yearlings further to the right on the graph, you can see that, yes, there is a difference, but there were some spike antlered yearlings that turned into 150 class bucks. There were some fork antlered yearlings that were 100 class bucks. So the pattern's there, but there's a lot of variation around it. What about at other ages? What about if we take deer antler scores at 2 years of age and compare them to what those bucks turned into at maturity? This is the graph of that. So 2-year antler score on the x-axis, and mature score again on the y or the left-hand axis there. And again, a positive relationship, but a fair amount of variation. If we've got 3-year-old bucks, a similar type pattern where we've got an increase in antler size as a 3-year at maturity as a buck's 3-year-old antler size increases. And at 4 years. In 4 years, it's starting to tighten up a bit. So if you know a buck's antler score at 4 years of age, you can be much more certain what its antler score at 5 years of age is going to be. So there's an advantage in perhaps in waiting a little bit to do some culling decisions, because you're more likely to know what that buck's going to turn into at maturity. So our original question was, if a buck is small at one age, will it remain small at older ages? And our answer to that question is yes, but there's a lot of variation. And so that's something that it's a piece of knowledge or information that you can use in making your decisions about whether shooting small antlered yearling bucks, for example, makes sense. Now, what about mature bucks? You could wait and just not do any culling until we got bucks that are at maturity, and that would make a lot of sense, especially if bucks don't change a lot from 1 year to the next. If bucks do change a lot from 1 year to the next, then just because he's small this year, it doesn't mean he's going to be small next year. And to look at that, we could use an idea called repeatability of antler size at maturity to investigate that. And this idea of repeatability can be summed up by what we're looking at here on the slide. If repeatability is near 0, that means that the buck's antler size has changed dramatically from 1 year to the next. And these top 2 bucks are 2 deer from our captive herd, and that and it's the same buck in different years from captive herd, you can see that buck's antlers change pretty dramatically from one year to the next. If we have a high repeatability, or repeatability, that is a buck more similar to what's on the left-hand side of the screen here. Again, another buck from our captive herd. Got pictures of him 2 years in a row, and you can see his frame and antler characteristics are very similar from one year to the next. And so if they change a lot, then you might be a little more nervous about culling or removing small antlered mature bucks than if their antlers stay very similar from one year to the next. So we had a graduate student here a couple of years ago, Aaron Foley, and he took data from our South Texas buck capture project and from a couple other buck capture projects. So he had 7 sites across South Texas that he included, and he took all the captures of mature deer and looked for instances in which we captured a deer twice, or a deer was while it was mature, or a deer was captured once when it was mature and then maybe harvested, and looked at this idea of repeatability. And we can see that the repeatability of score ranged from 0.59 to 0.82, and so there was some variation, but relatively high. Points were 0.42 to 0.64. Spread, again, similar to the overall score, relatively high, and the basal circumference a little bit lower, but still relatively high. So what this tells us that in general, there's a pretty good relationship of a buck's antler score from one year to the next when that buck's mature. A couple things to point out. One is of the characteristics I've listed here, the number of points has the lowest repeatability. And so it's going to be the characteristics that's going to change the most from one year to the next. And so as a culling criteria, the number of points may not be that good, because just because a buck is large this year doesn't mean he's going to, or excuse me, because he has a lot of points this year doesn't necessarily mean he's going to have the same number of points next year. And if he doesn't have very many points this year, he may actually end up with more points the following year. So number of points may not be the best criteria, but in general, small antlered mature bucks are going to be small antlered in subsequent years. Another thing that you'll notice here is there's a fair amount of variation on this repeatability, and that variation's from the different ranches. So some ranches had higher repeatability than others. And there's 2 factors that seem to explain those differences. One is that those areas that had highly variable rainfall had lower repeatability. And that makes sense. So if you're living in an area where you can end up with 2 Aprils that look like the 2 pictures on the right-hand side of the screen there, you're going to be in an area with pretty high variation in rainfall. And the repeatability of mature bucks' antler size is going to be lower. And then, like you might expect, having a pelleted supplement increased the repeatability of these antler measures, because there's a more consistent source of nutrition there. So that variation could be largely explained by differences in rainfall patterns and supplement, and that's some information that would be of use in making a decision on whether to cull on your property. So we've got some relationships between antler size of young deer and antler size of those mature deer when those deer mature. And then we've also got some information on how antler size, how repeatable it is from one year to the next in mature deer. So what about this idea of culling to improve the standing crop? Does that make sense? And does it kind of play out given all this variation around these relationships that we've just talked about? One way to think about this is to envision a situation like is shown on the graph here, where we've got an antler characteristic, and this may be gross Boone and Crockett score, maybe number of points, maybe spread, could be whatever, but it's an antler characteristic that's relatively low in in 1 year when those bucks are, let's say, 1 or 2 years of age. That's the black line there. And then the next year, when those bucks age a year, now they've got more points, or they've got larger Boone and Crockett score, or they've got larger spread, so their antler size increased the next year. If we don't have any culling, we just have a random harvest. We take a few of the deer on the low end of the curve here, we take a few deer from the middle, and we take a few deer from the high end. We end up with the next year the whole curve shifting to the right, because all those deer got a year older, but there's a lower curve because there aren't as many deer in the herd. We shot some of them. That's what we would get with a random harvest. If we have a cull where we say, okay, we're going to shoot all the smallest deer in this herd. So now we take off the deer on the left-hand side of that herd, we shoot a large number of them, and in this case it looks like we shot about all of them. The next year, our curve loses that left-hand tail. And so we could end up with an average that would have been here originally, but since we now no longer have those deer on the left-hand side because we harvested them, our averages moved up here. And so we have increased the average antler size of deer in that cohort, or that standing crop. This has nothing to do with genetic changes. This is just simply removing those smaller antler deer. So that's what we've got going with this idea of changing the standing crop and using culling to do that. So what happens if we remove all the smallest antlered yearlings? We're then more likely to also have fewer of these mature bucks with small antlers. But remember, there was a lot of variation around some of those relationships between yearling antler size and mature antler size. So how might all that play out? And one way of understanding how that would play out is to do a kind of simulation study. And Bronson Strickland and some of his colleagues at Mississippi State University did this a few years ago, where they got antler records from 220 captive bucks. And by antler records, I mean they had antler sizes at yearling, 2.5, 3 years old, 4 years old, and maturity. And they took that as their population, and they said, okay, let's have some different yearling cull criteria. Let's have 4 points or 6 points, and we'll remove a certain percentage of the small yearling bucks. And then of those that are left, we'll look at their antler size at 4 years of age. And if they don't have any culling going on, they just had a random harvest. So they go in and remove maybe 20% of the yearling bucks, and then of the remainder, they let those grow up to 4 years of age, and they look at the antler score of those. On average, the antler score was about 126 Boone and Crockett points. Now, what happens if we have a cull in here? And so one cull criteria would be to remove all the yearling bucks that have less than 4 antler points, have 2 or 3 antler points. So they've now harvested from the left-hand side of that bell-shaped curve that we were looking at. And they did a variety of different situations with the most intense culling of the yearlings, which I think may have been like 75% of them. The average antler size at 4 years of age increased from 126 inches with a random harvest to about 130 inches by removing all those smallest yearlings. And then they had another culling criteria in which they kind of did the opposite. They removed a certain percentage of the yearling bucks that had 4 or more points. So this might be an instance where you say, okay, we're going to set a yearling harvest criteria, and we want to protect some of our yearlings to try to get them to larger antler sizes. And so we're going to say that a buck has to have at least 4 antler points before it can be harvested. And so what they did, they protected the 2 and 3 point yearlings. The 4 and larger point yearlings got harvested. And what that did is that once that cohort got to 4 years of age, the average antler size dropped to about 120 inches. So because there's a relationship between yearling antler size and mature antler size, you can change the average of the antlers of the bucks that are left if you remove either the smallest yearlings or you remove the largest yearlings. So that knife can kind of cut both ways. All right, well, that gets us through this idea of culling deer, removing the smallest deer to try to improve the standing crop or just try to influence the distribution of deer that are on the property in that generation, in that cohort. The other reason, like we talked about, to remove deer, to cull deer, would be to try to influence the genetic composition of that herd and change antler size through time in future generations. For that to happen, for that to make sense, antlers, first of all, have to be heritable. In other words, if a sire has large antlers, his offspring have to be likely to have large antlers. And that does appear to be the case. Antler traits are heritable. There's a variety of estimates out there, and I'm going to use some from Lukafar and Jacobson that we're estimating relatively high heritability. So antler mass had 0.43, which is certainly high enough that it can respond to selection. Number of points in mature bucks was 0.39. Mean circumference was less heritable, 0.29. These are for mature deer. One thing to keep in mind is that the heritabilities were much lower for yearling bucks, for example, because their antler size can be influenced pretty heavily by the nutritional environment, by its mother and how well she was able to care for that fawn and produce milk for it, all that type of thing. But at maturity, the antler sizes the heritabilities of antler traits are certainly high enough that they can respond to selection. So antler traits are heritable. They can be altered through selection. And a lot of what's happened in some of the captive deer industry has shown how dramatically antler size can change. And I think a lot of that can be attributed to some of the selective breeding that's been done. Another study that helps illustrate this was a study done a few years ago on the Kerr Wildlife Management Area in their captive herd. They had an 8-year study in which they selected for yearling antler traits, and they selected pretty heavy, and I'll show you some data in a little bit about their criteria. In 8 years, we're able to increase the number of antler points, 3.2 antler points on yearling bucks, and I don't remember exactly where they started, but it was somewhere around 4 was the average number of antler points in a yearling buck, and they in 8 years increased that up to over 7. And they added 36 inches of Boone and Crockett points to yearling bucks, from the first generation that study started to the last generation that was born into that study. So really, in my mind, a dramatic change in the yearling antler sizes and a result of some selective breeding. So the intensity and the duration are really the key here, and the intensity is going to be defined by the proportion of cull bucks that you're able to remove and the proportion of cull does that you're able to remove or not have breed. And then the duration is the other key thing, the number of years it goes on. And so you could have a relatively low proportion of culling, kind of a low intensity, and it would just take a really long time to make any change. Or, like in some of these captive herds, you could have a really high intensity of culling, remove a high proportion of the smaller antlered bucks, and even do some selection on the doe side. And then you don't need that many years to make a change. So the question is, it appears, that antlers can be changed by selective breeding and culling, and the pen situations have demonstrated that. The key question for us here is does this culling for this purpose work in the wild? And I'm only aware of one study that this has been tried in South Texas anyway with whitetail deer, and it was a 7-year study done down here near Kingsville. And in this study, they designated 2 different pastures. One was about 9,500 acres, each of them were. One was a 9,500 acre treatment pasture in which bucks were culled based on antler size. And then a couple miles from that was a control pasture about the same size, in which there was just a light harvest of mature bucks, kind of a typical type harvest situation, but no younger bucks were shot. And in this study, we captured deer at random in October before the hunting season, so we got an idea of the distribution of antler sizes before the hunt began, and then used recreational hunting, rifle hunting, to do the culling, so trying to mimic what someone could do on their property. The cull criteria were any yearling buck with 5 or fewer points, so less than 6 antler points, and then for the older deer, any buck with less than 9 points. So any buck with 8 or fewer points was considered a cull and was removed. Over the course of the study, they had 66 one-year-old cull deer removed on that 9,500 acres and 79 bucks that were 2 years old or older. Notice my picture of the cull deer on the right there. That just happens to look like a longhorn. I'm not necessarily saying that longhorns would be a cull deer by definition, but in this case, it does have 2 antler points, and so it would qualify as a cull. Survival of the yearlings of those yearlings that had small antler points on the treatment area where they could be culled was 33%. On the survival of yearlings on the side that was the control and didn't have any culling going on was about 80%. So it was a dramatic decline in survival as a result of the culling efforts. And of any deer that had antler sizes that would have qualified as a cull during that particular year, they had about a 50% chance of being harvested, which on this scale was a huge effort. There was a lot of effort. So what happened? If we look at just the bucks born after the culling began, because it wouldn't make any sense to look at for a genetic change in bucks that were born before the culling began. So if we just look at bucks that were born in the year after the culling began, there were 44 bucks that met that criteria on the cull area, and 26 of those, or 59% of them, still met the cull criteria. And so they were born after the culling began, but they still had small antlers, small enough that they would be culled. On the non-cull area, there were 40 bucks that were born after the study began, after the culling began. 19 of those met the cull criteria, so it's about 48% met the cull criteria. This is the opposite of what we would think would happen if culling was really making a difference. The proportion of deer that we captured in October that met the cull criteria should be declining over time. And we just didn't see that in this particular study. So it's got a real dramatic effect in the pens. You can change antler size quickly through some selective breeding, but not in the pasture, not in this particular study. So why is that? One way to get our arms around what these differences were and why there's such a dramatic difference in the response to selective breeding or culling would be to take the information that we know about heritability of antler sizes, deer breeding, intensity of culling, and put that into a model, do some calculations, and try to predict what would happen. And Stephen Webb and some of his colleagues at Mississippi State did this. And what they did is made a computer model like that, and they used some animal science genetics models to do this, but they were able to put the right parameters in it to make it applicable to deer. And they were able, taking the results from that Kerr Wildlife Management Area study that I mentioned, they were able to predict the change in yearling antler points and the change in Boone and Crockett score that would occur given the intensity of culling that actually happened in that study on the Kerr area. The computer model predicted a change of 2.2 to 4.3 antler points. And remember, the actual, what the Kerr actually was able to do was to change antler size or number of antler points at 3.2 antler points. And so this model did a pretty good job predicting that. The difference between the 2.2 and the 4.3 is really just a difference in heritability estimates. There's some different estimates out there. If you use the higher heritability estimate, the model says you could change it by 4.3 antler points. If you use the lower heritability estimate, the model says it would change number of antler points would change by 2.2. If we look at the Boone and Crockett score, the model predicted a change from 19 to 38 inches, again, depending on the heritability estimates you use. And the Kerr's actual data found a change of 36 Boone and Crockett points. So this model does a pretty good job in predicting what would happen under a given level of culling. So the authors took the model and applied it to a field situation. And they modeled different population sizes, 100, 500, and 1,000 deer. And they modeled some different sex ratios with the number of does that an individual buck could breed. And they did these different scenarios over 20 years. And in the very best scenario, which was a high heritability, a buck breeding 3 does, which is kind of on the upper end of what you might think or we might find in the wild, and a pretty intense removal of cull bucks, about 50% of them, similar to what happened on that study on the King Range. The biggest change in number of antler points that was found was not quite 1 antler point. It was 0.9 antler points. So in 20 years of that type of culling effort that was mimicked in this study, you might bring the average antler points of mature bucks from 8 to 9. So just not a lot, not a lot of change is what this modeling study predicted, and what was also found at least over a 7-year period on that King Ranch study. So again, why the differences in these pen situations versus the pasture? In the pen situations, all the bucks that could be used for breeding that year were looked at, and only the top 15% were used. So it was an 85% cull rate, pretty intense. Because of the pen situation, there was also some selection possible on the does, because they could look at the history of that doe, her pedigree, and they could look at what types of fawns she produced, the antler size of her offspring, and so they could remove or keep does depending on those factors. They were able to take these 15% of these top end bucks and breed them to 10 or more females. I think it was an average of 12 females in each of the breeding pens with each buck. And so much fewer bucks breeding, only the very best, and they're breeding a lot of does. And then it was a confined population, so there weren't deer coming in from the outside into this. It was very much a controlled situation. And contrast that with the pasture situation, or out on a ranch. In that King Ranch study, a big effort was needed to get 55% of the bucks culled, and that's about what the Stephen Webb's genetics model was predicting. There's really no doe selection. It's hard to look at a doe and know what her genes are for antler production, and so there's really no way of doing that. And then in a wild situation, the number of does that an individual buck breeds isn't large. There's a lot of competition. Those does are all coming into heat around the same time, so the breeding gets spread out amongst a relatively large number of bucks, and so that dilutes the effect of any particularly large antlered buck. He just isn't breeding that many does. And maybe one of the biggest problems with an open pasture ranch type situation is that these populations aren't necessarily controlled. There's dispersal, and so some of the large antlered bucks may leave. And then there's immigration, so bucks that may come from populations that haven't been exposed to any culling, and they're going to move into this population. Particularly yearling bucks do this a lot. In fact, the yearling bucks from the cull areas, they're probably, that you left because they had really large antlers, they're probably going to leave. And you're going to get yearling bucks from surrounding areas onto the area that you're trying to manage. And we had some radio collars out at the time when that study on the King Ranch was going, and we documented that bucks are moving on to the cull area from surrounding areas, and some of the bucks that were not culled because they had really good antlers, they actually left that area. So having an open population really reduces the potential to make genetic change. So if we want to make some genetic change, and you want to do it relatively rapidly, you're going to need a high level of control. You're going to need control of which bucks are breeding, and to really make a strong impact, which does are contributing fawns to the population. You'd want some control on dispersal and immigration. To do all this, you would want a relatively small area. It'd be hard to do that on 100,000 acres, for example. But on 1,000 acres, you can get the intensity up high enough to remove the bucks that you might not want breeding, and there's some things that people will do with the does that I'll comment on here in a minute that you might be able to influence which does are breeding. And with a high fence, you can control the dispersal and immigration. So that's what the information that's available now, I think, would say about trying to change antler size of bucks in a field situation. A couple of thoughts here. There's a cost of culling, and one thought might, one response to all this might be, well, shoot, it's not going to hurt anything to shoot these smaller antlered bucks, so let's just do that, and we'll be better off. It's either going to be a neutral change, or we can make some positive changes, even if it's a relatively low intensity. And that's probably true with one exception, that by shooting these yearling deer, you end up with fewer numbers of these middle-aged deer, and by definition, you're going to have a smaller number of these mature bucks. And so that's going to be a cost, and that's something you need to figure out if that makes sense in your situation. If you remove half the yearling deer, you're going to end up with a lot fewer mature bucks in the herd. And the more intense the culling, the bigger this particular cost is going to be. A couple other considerations. The productivity of the herd is going to have something to do with your ability to use culling in your herd. If you've got a real low productivity herd, and they're just not making many fawns, not raising many fawns, recruitment's real low, shooting a whole bunch of small antlered bucks probably isn't going to make any sense, because your main management challenge is getting enough bucks into the herd to have something to hunt. and shooting a whole bunch of small ones is just going to leave you with a whole lot fewer deer. And that could be particularly true if nutrition is also limiting, because the antler size, even of the deer you leave, may not be, be dramatic, and your chance of making any big changes over time are going to be pretty small if nutrition is a big limit on the potential antler size that herd can attain. One thing that some people in in kind of a pasture situation will try to do to influence the doe side of the genetics is do something that I hear referred to commonly called as turning the does over. And what they mean is trying to harvest the older does on the assumption that the younger does were ones that had been produced since the culling began. And that makes sense. That's true. One caution on doing that, though, we've got some real good data from some recent kind of maternity studies that Randy DeYoung at the Cesar Kleberg Institute has done, and Aaron Foley was involved in these as well. This PhD student had done some of the repeatability work. They looked at using genetic markers. They could determine which does were raising fawns, and it was dramatic that even in a situation with pelleted feed, some of these fawn does were being bred, but we didn't detect any fawns that those young does produced. Yearling does, they're regularly bred, and often may have a single fawn or may have twins. And particularly in a situation with feed, they're probably going to have twins. We found very few, or Randy and Aaron found very few fawns being raised by these does that were bred as yearlings. A great majority of the fawns that were being raised and recruited into the population came from older does. And I think that's important because there's some knowledge that these does need and some experience that makes them effective mothers. And these young deer just don't have it. And so if you really get intense on this turning the does over and you turn your herd into a herd that has, 1- and 2-year-old does, our data would suggest that the productivity of that herd is going to decline. You're going to end up with a lot fewer fawns coming in. And young does often don't produce as much milk. They don't produce as big, healthy fawns as a mature doe would. And so you might also, even if some of those young deer are recruiting fawns, those fawns may not be as big and robust as you would get out of a mature doe. And some of that effect could carry on through that fawn's life as it matures, and it may just be set up to be a small deer, small antlered buck, for example, even though it came out of a doe that had been produced after a culling project had begun, or a culling program. So I encourage you to put that into your decision matrix. Another consideration of whether culling makes sense in your situation is the control that you have over the harvest. This includes hunters on your property and on adjacent properties. You could be shooting just the smallest yearling bucks, letting the upper half walk, but if the neighbors are harvesting them all, or you've got hunters on your place that see that 6-point yearling buck and think, wow, that's a pretty good buck, and they go ahead and shoot it, you're not going to be able to make much headway on a culling type program. Control of the deer population, particularly for if you're trying to influence the genetics, makes sense too. The population size can have a big impact, and then the immigration and dispersal. So if you're working on a relatively small piece of property, you've got 200 acres in an area of 100,000 acres of deer habitat, you don't have control over that whole deer population. You've only got an influence on a very small part of it. You're just not going to be able to make any big changes. You need to be working with the neighbors and things like that. And again, depending on how much control you have over the harvest, that could be a real drawback. And then the last thing that really need to consider is the role of mature bucks in your program, because there is this cost to culling. You're going to end up with fewer mature bucks if you're really effective on culling the young bucks. And so work that into your situation, and you may be all right with having a smaller number of mature bucks, but it's the real top end deer. That might mean that there may be fewer deer mature bucks available for your kids or grandkids or friends or whatever to come hunt, because it's only the real top end bucks that are left now. But that's just a decision that that you need to fit into your management program. So what does all this mean? Again, these results really aren't a management prescription per se. They're meant as some information that you can use in making some decisions on your own property and what makes sense in your situation. A whole bunch of people helped contributed to the deer capture work and that King Ranch Parks and Wildlife culling study, and need to acknowledge and thank the other PIs on that study. And then there's several people that have provided funding for some of this different work as well, and other support, and we need to thank them also. And with that, Clint, I can open things up and be happy to take any questions, assuming I haven't gone too long.
Thank you, Dr. Hewitt. We had a few questions that popped up already, and before we get to these, I'd like to encourage everyone to continue to post questions. Remember to post it to all participants in the chat window. That way everybody can see it, and I'll get it on my end also. The first question we had is, what percentage of bucks in the wild normally do not make it to age 5?
Yeah, and that's an important factor to put into all this, because just in general, there may be a 10 to 20% natural mortality loss as deer are aging. And so if you start out with 100 yearling bucks, only 50 of those may make it to maturity. So you're already going to lose some percentage of them just to natural mortality. That can be influenced by nutritional conditions. In other words, providing supplemental feed can increase the survival of these deer as they're working their way toward maturity. So it is something that can be changed, but it's just a product of being a wild animal. There's going to be some proportion of them that are going to die each year, and you need to kind of figure that into your calculations as well.
Okay, we've got quite a few rolling in now. Let's see, does it make sense to cull does that don't have fawns and appear mature?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and the study that Aaron Foley and Randy DeYoung did with the maternity would support that idea. And the reason I say that is when we look at just the mature does, there were some does of all these ones we looked at that just never produced a fawn or rarely produced a fawn. And then there were some that were producing fawns and raising them year after year after year. And so the idea of using fawn at heel as a criteria to maybe help guide some of your harvest decisions would make a lot of sense to me. There's some does that know how to do this and produce fawns regularly, and there's some does that for whatever reason, maybe socially they're in a bad place, maybe they just never learned how to, or I don't know what's going on, but there are some does that just don't raise fawns very often, and that would be a logical cull criteria on the doe side, given those types of relationships.
Okay. Next says, I live in a county with antler restrictions. I like the concept, but I'm concerned that it encourages narrower antlers. I have a couple of bucks that will never in their life be legal to shoot because they'll never be 13 inches wide. Is this a legitimate concern?
Yeah, it is, and that's the problem with any cull criteria. Is there's always going to be exceptions. You can design a criteria that's going to meet 90% of what you want to do, for example, but there's going to be that other 10% that that are configured in such a way that they just aren't able to those cull criteria just don't apply well to them. And so when it's a state level cull criteria and it's applied at a county level or something like that, you're just kind of stuck with that. On individual properties, if you live in an area that don't have state mandated cull criteria, then you've got some more flexibility, and you can respond to those types of deer that just don't fit whatever criteria it is you've set up on your property. But you're right. There's going to be some deer that might get harvested that the cull criteria you're trying to protect young deer, for example. And there's going to be some older bucks that just never get big antlers and never meet a 13-point spread, and they're just never going to be legal. That's going to happen.
All right. What about taking bucks that have a genetic antler deficiency, like no brow tines?
And that probably makes some sense, to the extent that this repeatability analysis says that antler characteristics at maturity are have relatively high repeatability. That would say that the next year a buck without brow tines this year is probably not is going to have weak brow tines the following year. So from a standing crop situation, that might make sense. From a genetic change standpoint, the ability to make any difference is going to be dependent on those factors that I mentioned. The intensity that you're able to do it, and that type of thing. And my guess is that on a genetic side, shooting some bucks that have weak brow tines probably isn't going to be making a real big difference. And it may take many years before it would change anything. But if you've got bucks to remove and you've got some deer that have those types of characteristics, that would seem like a useful criteria to act on.
All right, let's see where I was. Just the other day, I saw a newborn fawn here in Georgetown, Williamson County. Is that normal? And the next question with that is, does that mean that there's too many deer?
Yeah, no, it's not normal, but there's a couple of things that could happen. I think there's there's a greater likelihood for those really late-born fawns to have been coming from young deer. A doe fawn that they typically don't cycle till later, so a doe fawn would be bred later and would have her fawns later. A deer that maybe had some other nutritional issues early on and didn't cycle at the normal time and then cycled late, that would be another reason why you might have a late-born fawn. And to the extent that nutritional issues could be a problem, that could tie back to high deer densities. If there's some does that just weren't in good enough shape during the normal rut to be bred and instead got bred much later. Some potential, if sex ratios are really skewed, where does could not, may miss getting bred in a first or even second cycle because there's just too many does for those bucks to cover. But the age, I think, would be the first thing. Nutrition would be the second thing, and then if sex ratios are really skewed, that could also influence it.
Okay. One gentleman says, in one slide you showed antler characteristics and it listed mass and beam circumference separately. What is the difference between mass and beam circumference as a whole?
Yeah, actually, that's really good to point out that distinction. When I use mass in that slide, what it was really referring to is the antler weight. And so they cut the antlers off and actually weighed them. And then the circumference is exactly what it said. It's the circumference around the base of the beam. And so that when on that slide where mass was listed, that was kind of a variable to use to represent the overall antler size, without doing all the Boone and Crockett measurements, but just the weight of antler is what that was.
Okay. Makes sense. Next, we have the mature bucks in the herd I manage are generally mainframe 8 points. Should I remove them and hope the next cohort will be 10s to 12s?
Yeah, so in that situation, particularly if again you've got pretty good productivity, enough fawns coming into the herd, then starting on that lower end, and the lower end is going to be different in every place, and so so maybe 8 points is where you'd start, or maybe you start by leaving the 8s and betters, and if you've got some deer that even have smaller than that, maybe you'd start there and be looking for changes then. I think there's also a lot of benefit in addition to the culling. If there's anything nutritionally that you can do, antler size does respond strongly to some of these nutritional changes as well. So the decision would be dependent on the role of those 8-pointers in your program, and if you can get by with fewer of them for a while, then you could start some culling. And I just wouldn't expect any big changes from a genetic standpoint, in the short term. In other words, those people that say, hey, I've been culling for 5 years and I've seen changes, that's a standing crop or a cohort change. That isn't enough time for genetic changes to be happening in the mature deer. The very first deer that were born when they first started their culling weren't even 5 years old, at that point. So I guess take all that information and try to apply it to your individual situation.
Okay. Next, we have a question that says, have there ever been any studies related to environmental, i.e. oil and gas activity, or stress effects on antler development?
No, there haven't been. There's been a majority of the work looking at environmental effects on antler have all been nutrition related that I can think of. And these other kind of stressors, which are real, and obviously in some of these areas around Texas now, a tremendous amount of of changes in the landscape and activity and different things that may be causing stress in the deer's life. Those are definitely going on, but I'm not aware of any research that's been done that could really document that. One potential thing I could throw out there, one stress that can happen to deer in some of our management situations is by moving deer from one place to another. And we did a study a few years ago on deer that were moved under a triple T permit, and the next year the antler size on average of those deer that had been moved was smaller. And so that wasn't necessarily a nutritional change, but a social change for those deer. They're in a new environment, they're trying to fit in a new social situation, and I'm sure it was stressful for them. And we did see a decline in antler size on that, but relative to some of these these dramatic habitat changes that are going on and other stress that may happen with those, I'm not aware of anything.
Okay, looks like we have one more for right now. Have any studies been done on quote-unquote urban deer that live in a fairly confined area such as green belts, etc.?
Yeah, there have been, but I'm not aware of anything from an antler size standpoint. So most of those types of studies have been, looking at deer movement and survival and population sizes and that type of stuff. And we've got a study here at the Cesar Claiborne Institute ongoing right now up kind of on the northwest side of San Antonio with the survival and population size and movement objectives as part of it. Those urban deer are just a whole different critter. There's a lot of differences between them and free-ranging deer, and a lot of it's probably precipitated by the high deer densities that result in those urban situations.
All right, it looks like that's all the questions for right now. We've got a few more minutes left. If anybody comes up with anything, feel free to post it up. We'll wait just a second. Our next webinar is going to be on October 17th. It's going to be on wild turkey management, and Dr. Jim Cathy from A&M is going to be presenting that one. Dr. Hewitt, thank you for your time and for going through all this with us. I know it's an interesting topic, and a lot of people can directly apply it to their management.
Well, I appreciate the invitation and all the great participation we had.
Definitely. If anybody, once again, has any questions, just a couple more minutes. If not, please fill out the survey at the end of when we close, there'll be a survey that pops up. Please fill that out for us. It gives us a lot of really good information, helps us to continue to have really good webinars and address any concerns for the future. Looks like we may have had one more pop in here. It says, I'm in the hill country. Currently, your estimated density is a deer to 2.5 acres. Our harvest recommendations are quite high and will be in the upcoming years to reach a deer to 10. What harvest criteria would you recommend, if any?
Yeah, so if you're in a situation where you have to harvest some deer, it makes a lot of sense to me to start at the lower end and move up. And so, through camera surveys and previous observations on the buck side, you could set some criteria that are going to help you remove the lower end of your herd, whatever that lower end makes sense to be. And then on the doe side, if you're going to be harvesting pretty heavy to try to really change the density of that population, you're probably just going to start harvesting does, and being picky probably isn't going to be much of an option in that situation. Once you get things stabilized, I think there is some rationale for trying to maintain at least some of those mature does, and particularly those mature does that are raising fawns. But if you're in a situation where you just really got to knock them back, I wouldn't be picky on the doe side.
Okay, we had one more come in. Gentleman says, I joined late, so this may have already been answered. Can you cull more effectively if you aren't using supplemental feed? In other words, they produce what they can without help.
Right. Yeah, and we haven't talked about that really to speak of. So that's a good question. Supplemental feed is probably going to have two effects. One, it does appear to result in larger antlers. So, but I think it's kind of floating the whole boat up. All the whole population kind of rises up. The other thing that we did talk about is that supplemental feed can make the antler sizes less variable because you lose some of that environmental variation. Not all of it by any means, but you might tamp down some of that environmental variation. And so there is an idea out there that if you have that environmental variation, maybe you can use that to your advantage, so that in really poor years, you could you'd know which deer really don't have the ability to grow large antlers, in a variety of conditions, and so you could increase the culling then. And there's some basis for that. If I was owning property, I probably wouldn't take that approach because a lot of times in those poor years, if fawn crops are low and things, just really hitting a cohort hard because it was a bad year, would have some consequences further down the road because mature bucks would be something that would be important to me. But you might be able to use those poor years if you thought that was doable in your situation to further kind of differentiate bucks and their ability to perform under different conditions and use those poor years to remove those bucks that just don't grow large antlers in those bad years. So kind of wishy-washy answer, but other than some of the work done in the Kerr area, I'm not sure what else I'd add to that. And some of the work in the Kerr area suggests there is some benefit in increasing some culling effort in those dry years.
Sorry, I was muted there. Got two more questions, and then we'll shut it off there since it's a little after 1. The first one says, should you harvest doe fawns?
Yeah, and there's some rationale for that, and the rationale I would go back to is that idea that these young does, just aren't producing and raising fawns well, whereas mature does, that are doing it year after year, they're the ones that you're most likely to get the biggest, healthiest fawns out of and get them recruited. That having been said, you need some does moving into the population, so those mature does aren't going to be alive forever. I do know places that take that approach of shooting doe fawns, and I know places that take the approach of only shooting mature does, and I know instances or ranches with both with one or the other approach, and they're all producing really nice big mature bucks and seem to have successful programs. So that would say to me that it's probably playing around the edges a little bit, and if there are some differences, they may be small, but really the only information that I've got right now that would suggest shooting a doe fawn could be preferable over a mature doe is that mature doe, at least in the next couple of years, is going to be the one that's going to be producing the biggest fawns and probably most regularly. And that doe fawn, she's got 2 or 3 years before she'd get up to that point.
Okay. And one last question. How do you feel about cottonseed during post-rut and lactation?
Yeah, so cottonseed has some real advantages. It used to be cost, but that's not the case anymore. The feeding of it can be pretty easy in terms of equipment and supplies you need, and a little bit of fence and a T-post is a feeder, which makes things pretty easy. One potential drawback of cottonseed is it has a chemical in it called gossypol that can make animals sick. In some species, particularly some of the domestic species, it can cause some fertility problems. A little bit of evidence, there's some evidence in fallow deer that it can cause some fertility problems. We've done some work with cottonseed here with our captive deer herd, and we didn't see any of those negative problems with cottonseed. And one of the reasons is our deer in our captive situation, we just couldn't get them to eat enough cottonseed that the toxicity seemed to be a problem. Some of the advantages of cottonseed is it's high in oils, and those oils or fats have a lot of energy in them, so it's a good energy source. and it's pretty high in protein as well. So it's kind of a nutritional package. It's a pretty good option, and therefore for poster-up bucks, would be an advantage that way. And for does during lactation and after lactation, kind of during a recovery period, it could be a real advantage. I do know a number of places, and maybe just as a precautionary principle, will quit feeding cottonseed in September, October, so that the bucks, if there are any reproductive problems from the gossypol, the bucks would have a chance to clear that gossypol out of their system and reduce the chances of having some reproductive effects. So if you take that approach, it would limit the ability to use cottonseed for does recovering from lactation. But through the peak of lactation, yeah, I think it definitely has some, it's a viable supplement, and giving deer that choice and amongst all the other choices that you give, I think it'd be a wise idea.
All right, I appreciate that. Looks like we are down to the end. I think we've covered most all the questions. Once again, please fill out the survey at the end. If anybody would like to view this or any of the other webinars that we've put out, you can go to texaswildlife.org and find those webinars there under the resources section. Dr. Hewitt, thanks again for your time, and I think that'll be all for us.